So archaeologists tend to assign periods of time specific names that make it more possible for us to discuss and compare the long-term histories that we're interested in. These, of course, are not the names that Indigenous people would have had for the time periods in which they were living. We don't really have any way to know that. And so instead, we assign these arbitrary names that just allow us to have the conversations within the discipline. So the periods that we use in the Northeast to divide up pre-contact history are the Paleo-Indian period, which spans from the time that people first entered this part of the country up until about 8,000 BC. Then the Archaic period, which spans from about 8,000 BC to about 800 BC. And the Woodland period, which spans from 800 BC right up until the arrival of European colonists into the Northeast. So for archaeologists, each of these periods is defined by certain cultural traits. So while we can't know that people in the past would have divided up time in this way, we do use information about how people were living in the past to create these periods. So to explain the ones that I just gave, Paleo-Indian people hunted now extinct megafauna, things like mammoth and mastodon, during the end of the last ice age, whereas Archaic people were mobile foragers who moved around the landscape seasonally, and they subsisted on many of the same wild plant and animal resources that we see today, things like deer and various wild plants. And then woodland people settled down into permanent settlements in particular places on the landscape, and they began doing things like using pottery and cultivating their own plant foods rather than relying exclusively on wild plants. So of course, each of these broad periods can then be subdivided into smaller periods of time. So for example, if we take the big broad woodland period that runs from 800 BC all the way up until the arrival of Europeans, we can break that down into the early woodland period, which spans from about 800 BC until the year 0, the middle woodland from 0 to AD 900, and the late woodland from about AD 900 up until contact. So again, these are terms that archaeologists are using to help them describe what's going on, say, in the Delaware Water Gap area and how that compares to what's going on in upstate New York. These periods, so you could take the late woodland period and then you can divide it up even further based on variation in both cultural characteristics through time and cultural characteristics across space. So these smallest divisions, we use the term phases to describe those. And they're often defined by things like particular styles of pottery decoration or the occupation of certain important places on the landscape. And those tend to have more interesting names. So rather than something like the early woodland or the middle woodland or the late woodland, these might be the Paquara phase or something that is a little bit more based in the place names of the area where Indigenous people were living at the time. Well, maybe I should start by saying I think it's important to view the patterns and the designs on baskets in multiple ways. Both these patterns can emerge from the actual weaving of the basket, or they can emerge by decoration that's added later after the basket is made. So to make baskets like this, sections of trees would have been soaked, and then strips from these soaked sections would have basically been beaten until the growth rings of the tree actually separated. These thin strips that resulted from this process, we usually call them splints, would be what was used for weaving the baskets. And weavers often used a sort of checkerboard motif to weave together the splints and other plant materials, which creates a pattern on the surface of the basket. And I think it's part of the sort of weaving process, but it also gives a really beautiful look to the exterior of the basket. And then in some cases, not all cases, the artist chose to add more decoration to the exterior using block stamps with simple designs or using a technique called swabbing, which basically involved painting designs onto select areas of the basket's exterior. So the designs on the baskets that are displayed in this gallery would likely have been made from block prints, whether those are made out of carved wood or perhaps even something like a potato. So they would have been dipped in an ink and then pressed onto the exterior of the basket. And the specific designs that were carved into those block stamps would have been derived from a wide variety of sources. So we know that Native people included many traditional patterns that were also used on their pottery or on their clothing, perhaps even in tattoos, while others were drawn from more recent inspirations, things like European contact and the images and the illustrations that they saw in their contact with European people. So artists were making individual choices about what they included on their pots, and they may, on their baskets, and they may have chosen to include abstract or realistic representations of the things most important to them. So you could see an abstract representation of something like the family or other tribal members. You could see a very realistic pattern based on a plant food or a plant medicine. You could see natural resources like the sun or like water or like the dirt. And then you could even see important places on the landscape. And it's very difficult for archaeologists or anthropologists to look at an individual design and know exactly what it would have meant to the artist who put that design on the basket. But we know that they were drawing their inspiration from images that they could see in other places, images that they could see in the world around them, and images that held some sort of special meaning to them. Pottery is my favorite thing to talk about. That's what I spend most of my time studying. So for archaeologists, pots are incredibly important pieces of material culture. One reason that they're so important is that they break frequently. So they end up in the archaeological record and they become artifacts that we can study and learn about the people who made them and used them. So when we sit down to study a pot, or we often refer to pottery as ceramic material, archaeologists are looking at a pretty wide variety of traits, including things like the shape of the pot, the size of the pot, any decoration that's added to the exterior of the pot, and then evidence of the use of that pot itself. And so the shape and the size of the vessel can tell us a lot about how the pot's maker intended it to be used. So when someone sits down to make a pot, they have a particular function in mind, and they're making choices about the shape and the size of that pot with that intended use in mind. So as an example, pots with really large capacities and restricted necks, so small areas up at the top, just like the jar that's displayed in this exhibit, may have been made to cook or store food for larger groups of people. While on the other hand, a smaller vessel with a large open mouth, something like a bowl that we might eat cereal out of, was likely used to serve individual portions of food and wouldn't have been very useful for storing things long term. So the fragment that we're able to see in this gallery is a collared vessel. And this means that there's a vertical or nearly vertical portion of the pot that appears above a constricted neck. This vessel also has something that we call a castellation, or a raised decorative point around its rim. This is something that's really iconic of this time period and of this place, adding these castellations to decorate the rim of the vessel. Interestingly, there's also evidence of sooting on some of the vessels in this gallery. This is a clear sign that they were used over fire, which adds evidence to the understanding that they were used for cooking, which was initially garnered from the shape and the size of the vessel. But that was really about intended use, and seeing the sooting tells us about actual use, not just what did the potter who made the pot intend, but what did the person who used the pot actually do with it. So as anyone might imagine, pots that are used over and over again often break and crack, and some of the vessels in this gallery show pairs of holes that are drilled on opposite sides of a crack. These holes would have been used to mend the vessel by lashing the crack together using strips of hide or strips of fiber. Now, of course, while many vessels would have cracked during use, only some of them in the archaeological record show evidence of mending, and this likely indicates that these examples were especially important to their owners. This could be because they were particularly useful, or because they held some more sentimental meaning. Perhaps they were inherited from their parents, or they were made for them by someone who was particularly special to them. We can never know exactly why a particular pot was mended, but the presence of those mend holes likely indicates a particular level of value for the person who took that pot, probably used it in a way that caused it to crack, and then eventually decided that this one was worth taking the time to mend.